Hey everybody, welcome to story time this evening. I think it's December 4, right? Yes, so we're on our fourth story, and it's called There's a Song in the Air. It's taken from this book called The Best of Christmas in My Heart. Tonight you get the glasses. Kind of depends on how dark it is outside, and it's becoming dusk, and it depends on how small the words are in the book. So, There's a Song in the Air by Catherine Reeves. Thomas and Amy Martin had once had it all, each other, a lovely home, and Carol. Then Carol was taken from them, and there was no longer much to live for. As for adopting a child, not even Vinny could persuade them to consider such a thing. Then came a strange little face in the ivy. Amy Martin took the second best broom from its corner on the back porch and went out to sweep the walk under the grape arbor. The bricks here were uneven, and some of them were mossy and held the moisture. If ice collected, Thomas might slip and fall when he took the trash out to the alley. At least that was the excuse she gave herself. But she really wanted to see if the child was there again this morning. She didn't like to admit it to herself, but something about the whole affair gave her a slightly uncomfortable feeling. For 3 weeks, ever since she had first been aware of the face staring at her through the December tangle of vines on the back fence, the fence that shut her property off from the alley, she had not quite felt that she belonged to herself. Her privacy was crumbling, and all because a strange child insisted on watching her whenever she came out the back door. It was a mysterious kind of thing. There was no young child that she knew of in any of the homes whose back gates opened on the alley. And this child was a silent, shabby little thing, acting as though she knew that she shouldn't be here. The one time when Amy had spoken to her and said, "Where's your home, little one?" the child had stared at her, then had run down the alley and disappeared. She had dropped one faded, dirty mitten in her plate. The mitten, washed and mended, now lay on the shelf on the back porch. Amy had planned to give it to her this morning. The bricks of the wide old walk under the arbor were laid in herringbone style, and even in winter fine green lines of moss outlined the pattern. In a way, the arbor was like Thomas and Amy Martin. It clung a little to the past, as though, if it waited, it might recapture what had gone. In this respect, too, it was like the quiet, polished house that also seemed forever to be waiting, like the attic where the dollhouse stood in its dust cover of unbleached muslin, where the little beaver muff lay in the red holly red box, swathed in tissue and mothballs, where the bright music box waited to play its tinkling tune of Christmas. There's a song in the air. There's a star in the sky. Amy swept carefully, working her way to the very end of the arbor and the alley gate before she allowed herself to look. But there was no small face framed in an old woolen scarf peering through the palings. Amy was aware of a sharp sense of something in her breast. Relief, no doubt. Well, she had said almost out loud, knocking the broom against the fence to clear it of leaves and twigs. Maybe the visitation is over. Maybe every move I make won't be watched now. And just to be sure she was at last completely free of the black eyes, she unlatched the back gate and looked searchingly up and down the alley. It was empty except for the neat rows of trash cans set out beside each householder's gate in readiness for the weekly collection. As she stood there, the Warrens' cat, pursued by the Adams dog, streaked past her and up one post of the arbor. Here's Kitty. This is probably the most she's ever searched out the tree. Hopefully, I've seen some posts on Facebook about cats in trees and trees falling over. Hopefully that's not the way it ends up. Anyway, let's see, where was I? Oh yes, the cat and the dog. They streaked past. From the security of the top, her sharp, indignant hiss, the cat, was loud in the silence of the alley. But there was no child. Amy latched the gate then went slowly back up the walk to the house. "What kind of child is it?" Thomas asked her at supper. Of all the silly questions a husband could ask, this was about the silliest. What kind of child? Why, just a plain child, you know what a child is, Tom. He ignored her heavily ironic tone. How old, Amy? Boy or girl? Girl. I say she's 5 or 6, maybe. She watched him narrowly, but there was no change in the expression on his face. Mostly eyes. She just stands there and watches me with those big black eyes. Never speaks. Wonder why she isn't in school in the daytime. But I can't see anything to get upset about, dear. Probably just thinks you're a funny old woman. And how right she is. He laughed and passed his plate for more peach pie. But the words in the laugh didn't seem gay and impertinent, as she knew that he meant them to be. She tried to match his effort. I don't mind being called funny, but old? Thomas Martin, if you begin calling me an old woman now, when I'm 37, what will you be calling me when I'm 60? Anyways, you're 2 years older than I am, don't forget. But the words sounded hollow to her, and when she looked across the table into Tom's face, she saw the old wound there, the shadow that was somehow deeper at Christmas than at other times, or harder to mask, perhaps. She put an extra spoonful of peaches on his plate and passed it back to him. Want to go to a movie? Dickens' Christmas Carol is playing downtown somewhere. The lights might be pretty tonight, too. No, thank you, dear. I feel a little tired tonight. Let's just sit by our own fire. Suits me. He got up and went around the table and bent down, putting his lips against her cheek. She reached up and held his face against hers for just an instant. If we could just stop the clock, or better yet, set it up into the new year. Amy, have you thought that maybe we're alone too much these days? I mean, maybe we've... The doorbell chimed musically through the house, and there was a sound of quick footsteps in the hallway. Then the footsteps paused, and in a moment a voice called, "Where is everybody? Any coffee left? I could use a cup." Vinny! The middle-aged woman who came through the doorway into the dining room was peeling off her driving gloves. Her head was bare, and her dark graying hair was blown. In the heavy gabardine car coat, with its pushed-back hood, she seemed shapeless, sturdy, and plain, but her cheeks were as red as those of a child who had been playing in the sun, and her eyes of deep, clear blue were so candid and beautiful they caught the eye of the beholder immediately. It was a lived-in face, strong, vital. Thomas took her gloves and coat. "Sit down, dear. I'll get you a napkin and some silver." He pulled out a chair for her. "Have you had any supper?" Amy lifted her face for Vinny's kiss. "I imagine that's a foolish question. Hamburger at the diner between calls, but their coffee isn't any good. Do I see peach pie?" Amy poured coffee and served a plate of dessert for her. Good. No one in the world but you and my grandma ever made dried peach pie as good as this." She favored the food. "You look tired, Vinny, and we haven't seen you for days. When did we last see her, Tom?" "When she came for Sunday breakfast and had an emergency call before she got in the door. 2 weeks ago, that was. That was old Mr. Willoughby's hip. He's doing fine now. His daughter's taking him home with her as soon as he can be moved. The children want Gramp home for Christmas, and I'm going to let him go. Will things let up a bit, do you think, with the holidays so close?" "I don't know, Tom. I don't understand why it is, but the nearer Christmas gets, the worse life is for a doctor. People seem to confuse me with a social worker or a pastor. I've been called for as many sick hearts today as I have sick bodies. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference," said Tom. "Why do people have to break up their homes at Christmas? Any time, for that matter. But why must children have to take it in on the chin at Christmas? Why do people who aren't going to stick together ever have children anyway? I'm getting pretty sick of this casual attitude toward children, especially at Christmas." "I suppose," said Tom, "if a child is going to break up the fact that it's Christmas isn't of any special significance. It's the breakup that matters." He said, "I suppose," said Tom, "if a home is going to break up the fact that it's Christmas isn't of special significance. It's the breakup that matters, regardless of when it comes, if there isn't any love to hold things together." "Why is there such a dearth of that basic commodity?" She laughed. "Somebody ought to study the economics of love, supply, and demand." There was silence for a moment. Then Vinny reached out and put a hand on Amy's. "I haven't forgotten what tonight is. Thank God you've had love to pull you through." It's a hard day, said Amy. It's just that her birthday is tomorrow, Christmas Eve. We've always celebrated it then, you know? That makes it harder, and in a way easier, to ask you what have come to ask you, said Vinny. There was stillness so deep it could almost be heard in the room. The grandfather clock in the library ticked in, ticked in its steady, relentless way, giving each second its full and proper place in the passing parade of time. A gust of wind blew a branch against the side of the house with a soft, sweeping sound. The kettle over its low flame in the kitchen snored gently. Each sound was round and whole in the intense stillness of the dining room. I've been trying to make up my mind all day to come to you, said Vinny. It's about a child. Thomas put down his fork, and it clattered sharply on the edge of his plate. No, he said, his voice coming out harsh and strained. No, Vinny, don't try to do us good. We can't stand it. We don't want a child. We don't want anyone here in Carol's place. Carol is dead. No child can take her place. We have forgotten how to be parents. Don't ask us, Vinny, because we'll have to say no, and it will hurt us all. Amy looked first at her husband, then at Vinny, whose blue eyes were full of love and compassion. Vinny, dear Vinny, we know you love us. Amy spoke gently, but her voice was tired and old. For 3 long years you've tried all the ways you know to help us, but a child isn't the answer. She put her face to her hands, in her hands. Can't you understand this simple thing, Vinny? When you've lost so much of what your hope and love were built on, there's nothing that can be a substitute. Yes, said Vinny quietly, I can understand that. It was that very thing that brought me to you. I felt that you two, of all the people I know, would understand that. Stop it, said Thomas. I know what you're trying to do, Vinny, but Amy and I have come to some kind of equilibrium, and we're not going to have it undone for anyone or anything. Listen to me, you two. Vinny's voice was warm and very gentle, but there was an insistent quality in it that drew the eyes of the other two to her face. Just listen a minute, without talking, without resisting me. The urgency in her tone cut through the gentleness. I am not conniving in any way to get you involved emotionally with a child. I've always tried to be straightforward with you, and I shall be now. I know no one better how you've struggled to accept the fact that one snowy December afternoon 3 years ago, your 6-year-old child steered her sled into the path of a truck and was killed. Maybe you remember that I was with you that night. She looked from one face to the other. The faces she looked into were bleak, remembering. But maybe you've forgotten something else. For a whole year after Carol's death, her friends trooped through this house and yard, using her roller skates, swinging in her swing, playing with her dolls, reading her books. And why? The clock struck a deep, mellow tone for the half hour. Because you wanted it that way. You wanted to keep that kind of love alive. The blue eyes were very bright. It was one of the loveliest things I've ever known. One of the most truly beautiful things. I'd seen it once before with a mother and father who'd lost their only son, but the difference is they were able to go on giving to children. What happened to you? Lots of things. Thomas' voice was low. The children began to forget Carol. New children came into the neighborhood. The house was just a big kooky jar inhabited by 2 funny people. You know what happened as well as we do. So you began to close the door, Vinny sighed. Well, I came to ask you to take a child in for a few weeks as a humane act to me and to her. There's literally no place for her to go. Where are her parents? That's a long story, Tom. She's one of the casualties. She's one of those who are taking it on the chin, not only at Christmas. It's been 3 years now since she knew any kind of stability, and before that I can guess that there wasn't much love. Amy refilled Vinny's cup. There was a stillness on her face, and she did not speak. She's been riding around with me all day while I made my calls. It was one notch better than spending the day in the county welfare worker's office, which was the alternative. The worker and I have been trying to find a place for her. No one wants her. Vinny's voice was bitter. The family where she was temporarily placed simply refused to keep her another day. They said she ran away. whenever they let her out of their sight, and they never knew where she was. Did she? Amy's voice was very quiet. It seemed on the surface disinterested, but Vinny sensed something indefinable in it. Yes, I think she did. She says she wasn't running away. She was just visiting her lady. That's all we can get out of her. Her lady. Thomas and Amy said the words together. Yes, when we ask her where her lady is, she says, sweeping the walk, or in the backyard, or something that doesn't make sense to us anyway. Amy's gaze was locked with Thomas. But if there was anything unusual in this, Vinny didn't seem to notice. She cried once today. Of course it was a rough day, waiting in the car for me, or sitting in the hospital lounge while I made rounds. When I asked her what the trouble was, she said she'd lost her lady. Poor baby. She's been through so much disaster, and now there's not even her make-believe lady to cling to. Where is she now, Vinny? Vinny didn't speak for a moment. Then she took a long breath, which was something like a child's sigh of disappointment. Asleep on your living room couch. I carried her in and put her down there. She was exhausted. The sound at the doorway was very slight, but it drew the attention of all of them. Speaking of angels, Vinny got up and started toward the door. A strange little figure stood there. The car blanket in which she had been wrapped trailed around her. Her tired little face was framed in a blue woolen scarf knotted under her chin. She looked at the group around the table, her great black eyes masking as best they could her fear and weariness. She looked from one to the other, the two seated at the table, and Vinny, standing with her hand on the back of Tom's chair where she had paused, seeing the look on Amy's face. Then, as though she could not believe what her own eyes beheld, the child stared at Amy. Slowly, a look of complete joy and recognition flooded her face. My lady, she cried, running and stumbling, the heavy blanket still around her, toward Amy. She would have tripped and fallen had not Tom scooped her up, blanket and all, and put her in Amy's lap. We found her, the child called to Vinny. We found her. She was waiting for me. What goes on here? Vinny's amazement was too real for them to doubt that this was a complete surprise to her. Amy untied the blue scarf. The child sighed and put her head on Amy's breast. With a gentle hand, Amy brushed the tangled dark hair back. That's a long story, too, she said. Tom, warm a cup of milk, dear, and then, would you please bring me a nightie and a robe, the pink one, from the chest in Carol's room? Yes, darling, said Tom, stopping to lay his face for a moment on her hair. I know the one you mean. Vinny looked at them. Then she picked up the car robe and folded it carefully, matching the edges and smoothing the fold. Amy was humming to the child, whose lips were drooping. There's a song in the air. There's a star in the sky. And they lived happily ever after. At least I hope they did. Thank you for listening and reading this story with me this evening. I hope you have a happy evening, and I'll see you tomorrow for another story.